There are films that go unnoticed, others that mark a generation, and a select group that goes beyond the screen, leaving a cultural scar hard to erase. In 2004, an unexpected work became one of those rare phenomena. It was not just about the box office, nor only about the controversy. What hid behind the cameras, the unexplained accidents on set, the risky decisions and the worldwide repercussion revealed something that seemed to surpass the limits of cinema. What really happened during the production of The Passion of the Christ? Why did so many involved report strange experiences, as if the very film carried a weight greater than they could bear? And how did this work, directed by Mel Gibson, manage to divide the audience between devotion and rejection, provoking debates that still echo almost 2 decades later? Throughout this investigation, we will dive into the backstage, from the daring choice to film in ancient languages, to the unexpected episodes that marked the cast. We will revisit the overwhelming impact the work caused on the public and the shadow it left over the careers of its protagonists. This is not just the portrait of a film, but of a cultural phenomenon surrounded by mystery, pain, and fascination. The project was born as a personal obsession of Mel Gibson. While many directors pursued commercial formulas, he decided to invest his fortune in something few believed viable: a brutally realistic narrative about the last hours of Jesus. No English dialogues, no concessions for the traditional market, with an aesthetic loaded with suffering and graphic violence that bordered on unbearable for part of the audience. That choice was not an aesthetic detail. It was a declaration of war against Hollywood's model of religious cinema, almost always polished, symbolic, adapted to please everyone. Gibson preferred the risk of shocking the masses to softening his vision, and that would determine the fate of everything that followed. But what almost no one expected is that, behind the scenes, this pursuit of authenticity would bring a series of events that made many wonder if there was something beyond chance happening on that set. Before that, however, it is important to understand the ground where this story began. The Passion of the Christ did not count on the support of major studios. It was an independent project, financed by the director himself. Filming took place in Italy, with an international cast. For Gibson, historical fidelity was essential. The dialogues were recorded in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin. The production team even rebuilt environments inspired directly by the architecture of the time. That zeal for authenticity impressed, but also made everything more fragile. Limited budget, external pressures, religious controversies, and the growing feeling that something greater was at stake. It was in this scenario that emerged the figure of Jim Caviezel, the actor chosen to play Jesus. He was exactly 33 years old during filming, the same age attributed to Christ in his final days. His casting already raised curious symbolisms: initials JC, a career on the rise, and the willingness to face a role nobody wanted to assume. Caviezel dove so deeply into the character that his life blended with the role. On set, he faced almost inhuman conditions: intense cold, long hours tied to a wooden cross, accidental blows that left real marks on his body. But some incidents drew even more attention. During one of the shootings, Caviezel was struck by lightning. Yes, lightning, right on the set, before the crew. And he was not the only one. A production assistant was also struck on another occasion. Both survived, but the shock of these events increased the aura of mystery surrounding the production. Such episodes added to other reports of difficulties, accidents, and daily tensions. For some, it was merely the consequence of a demanding set and a physically intense film. For others, there was something symbolic, almost spiritual, involving everything. While the crew faced physical pain and strangeness behind the scenes, outside, the world waited. News about the project circulated long before the release. The promised explicit violence, the decision not to use English, and Gibson's controversial reputation as filmmaker and public figure fueled debates. When the film finally hit theaters, the impact was immediate. The lines were enormous, often organized by entire religious groups. At the same time, critics accused the work of being excessively cruel, or even of carrying problematic messages. That collision between devotion and rejection was what turned The Passion of the Christ into something larger than a simple production. It was as if each viewer had to choose a side, to see their unique spiritual experience or an unnecessary display of suffering. And it was precisely at that point that the work began to reveal its true weight. Because what happened outside the screens was no less intense than what was before the audience's eyes. That was only the surface of what was happening. In the corridors of production, in later testimonies, and in the silent stories of part of the cast, emerged clues that there was much more than the public ever knew. And it is exactly in this obscure territory that the narrative begins to deepen. The overwhelming success of The Passion of the Christ seemed, at first glance, the confirmation that Mel Gibson had triumphed against all odds. The film grossed hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide, becoming the most watched non-English language title in history until then. But behind the numbers, an atmosphere of discomfort and mystery only grew. The stories coming from the backstage did not disappear. On the contrary, they echoed even more disturbingly when contrasted with the impact the work generated in theaters. Jim Caviezel, who had put body and soul into the role, began to feel the weight of his decision. The actor revealed in later interviews that Gibson had warned him before filming, accepting to play Jesus could mean the end of his career. And, in a way, that is exactly what happened. Caviezel began to face a kind of blockade in Hollywood, as if he had become a risky name for major productions. He himself admitted that, after the film, doors closed and the number of invitations plummeted. For many, it was the invisible price of having associated himself with such a controversial project. Behind the scenes, the physical marks left by the role went beyond fiction. Caviezel suffered shoulder dislocations while carrying the cross, contracted pneumonia due to the intense cold during filming, and even had parts of his skin burned by the sun and constant friction. Some colleagues reported that he seemed not to act, but literally to live the martyrdom he staged. This fusion between character and actor generated respect, but also a certain fear. It was as if the role had consumed more than it should. Meanwhile, Mel Gibson faced a storm of his own. The commercial success of the film was not enough to shield him from criticism. Newspapers and cultural commentators accused the work of being excessively bloody, of fueling religious prejudices, and even of emotionally manipulating the audience. The controversy was not limited to cinema. It spread into politics, social debates, and relations among religions. With each screening, it seemed the public did not leave indifferent. Either they felt deeply touched or deeply disturbed. The international impact also brought surprises. In several countries, there were reports of spectators fainting during the projection, unable to withstand the graphic violence. Hospitals near theaters even recorded cases of malaise related to screenings. For defenders of the film, this only reinforced its authenticity. For critics, it was a sign of excess and exploitation of pain. The contrast between faith and discomfort made the film an emotional battlefield. And it was not only the audience that seemed to react unusually. Part of the cast reported strange personal experiences during production. Some mentioned moments of absolute silence on set, as if an invisible presence dominated the environment. Others spoke of a constant emotional weight, a feeling that they were involved in something far greater than a cinematic job. Few were willing to give details in interviews, but the simple refusal to speak already fed the mystery. Over time, these stories gained almost mythical contours. For some, they were coincidences amplified by the weight of the theme. For others, they were signs that the project had stirred forces beyond human control. The truth is that, regardless of interpretation, the atmosphere surrounding the Passion of the Christ became increasingly enigmatic. And there was also the silence. The silence of many actors and professionals who, after the release, avoided publicly revisiting their experiences. A silence that, in the context of so many strange stories, sounded even more eloquent. It was as if part of the crew had decided certain backstage moments should remain hidden. That absence of clear testimonies only reinforced the aura of mystery. Meanwhile, Mel Gibson, despite the commercial triumph, carried his own shadow. The film placed him on a pedestal and, at the same time, at the center of controversies that would affect his image for the following years. The director, who already faced personal criticism and reputation problems, seemed to have found in the project both his consecration and his curse. The result is that The Passion of the Christ consolidated itself as much more than a film. It was a phenomenon that crossed cultural borders, provoked global debates, and left a trail of unanswered questions. What happened behind the scenes was not forgotten, but neither was it explained. Each fragmented account, each insistent silence, each strange coincidence continued to feed the sense that something was hidden. And it is precisely in this nebulous ground where reality and myth blur that we find the most intense and disturbing part of this story. The moments when the film set stopped being only a workspace and became stage for episodes that still defy clear explanations. The months that followed the release of The Passion of the Christ revealed a plot almost as intense as that of the work itself. If on screen the suffering was explicit, outside it the weight seemed to manifest in other ways, discreet yet equally striking. The cast and crew carried signs of an experience hard to translate into words, and little by little emerged reports that drew an unsettling picture. Jim Caviezel, protagonist of the story, became a living symbol of that impact. Not only did he see his career slow drastically, but also began reporting personal experiences that many interpreted as echoes of the role itself. He even suffered real injuries during filming, violent falls, pneumonia, burns, as if he had physically endured his own personal via crucis. Over time, in interviews, he described that work not as acting, but as a calling. That insistence on treating the film as something spiritual, more than artistic, helped reinforce the idea that the set had been staged for something that surpassed the limits of cinema. Other cast members also went through radical transformations. Luca Leonello, the actor who played Judas and until then declared himself a convinced atheist, claimed to have changed his life after the filming experience. He decided to convert, convinced he had felt something that could not be explained only by the script or the emotional weight of the role. That testimony, although little publicized at the time, echoed in religious circles as proof that something supernatural might have manifested during production. But the most enigmatic aspect came from those who preferred silence. Costume designers, lighting technicians, supporting actors, and even extras who lived only a few days on set repeatedly refused interview invitations. Some justified it by saying they did not want to revisit painful memories. Others simply offered no explanations. Journalists who tried to investigate more deeply ran into evasive answers or a wall of absolute silence. No scandal or crime seemed to be hidden, but the collective refusal to talk suggested the experience had been too intense to expose. Scattered reports mentioned disturbing dreams, sensations of invisible presence, and even sudden behavioral changes during the filming period. Some described the set as a charged, almost sacred space that provoked deep emotional reactions in those who entered it. Curiously, these testimonies never unified into an official narrative. They surfaced in fragments, pieces of memory that together formed an incomplete and even more mysterious puzzle. Meanwhile, Mel Gibson faced his own downfall. If the work had elevated his name to that of a visionary, it also opened the way for relentless scrutiny. His controversial statements, personal scandals, and even an arrest reinforced the image of someone pursued both by fame and by his own inner demons. Gibson himself hinted, in vague remarks, that the reaction against him was not entirely natural, but a direct consequence of the impact of his film. For some, that seemed mere paranoia. For others, it sounded like one more piece of the puzzle, the idea that the Passion of the Christ had triggered greater forces, visible and invisible, that exacted a high price from all involved. And so, almost 20 years later, a difficult question still hovers. What really happened behind the scenes of this project? Was it only the psychological weight of portraying the most brutal violence in Christian history, added to the isolation of a closed set? Or something more, something that does not fit rational explanations, manifested during those weeks of shooting? The facts are in sight: ruined careers, transformed lives, unexpected conversions, eloquent silences, and an atmosphere of strangeness that persists to this day. For many, these are merely the natural consequences of a bold and controversial film. For others, it is impossible not to see signs of something beyond human control. What is certain is that the Passion of the Christ surpassed its role as a cinematic work. It became a watershed not only in the industry, but in the life of each person who took part in it. Some carried wounds, others revealed renewed faith, and many simply vanished from the public radar, as if preferring to keep secret what they had witnessed. And perhaps that is the most disturbing point: the silence that endures, the absence of definitive answers, the feeling that the real story remains untouched, hidden behind the cameras. The film showed the world the pain of Christ, but the backstage seems to hold another kind of suffering, invisible, intimate, impossible to capture on screen. After all, was The Passion of the Christ only a daring film that divided opinions? Or, in the process of portraying humanity's most known pain, was something awakened, something that even today no one feels ready to reveal? That is the invisible cross that remains on the shoulders of those who lived that experience. And perhaps we will never have a clear answer, because certain stories were not made to be explained, only felt.